I knew we were screwed when Mason Clark put 13 names on that screen. Mine was at the top. Fraud, he said, like he was reading the weather report. 13 people. Terminated. Effective immediately. The board was watching on video screens from their safe little boxes. Nobody in that room was going to save us. I'm Lucas Reed, by the way. 48 years old, Chief Risk Officer at Summit Financial Group in Chicago. Or I was anyway, until that moment. Look, I've been around long enough to smell a setup. 8 years in the Army teaches you to read situations before they blow up in your face. This wasn't about fraud. This was about something else entirely. Mason stood there like he owned the world, all calm and collected, presenting what he called a fully audited financial summary. He didn't ask who was responsible, he just announced it. According to him, my risk division had manipulated internal controls. Transaction integrity was compromised. Oversight had failed. He talked like the verdict was already carved in stone somewhere above our heads. There will be no internal investigation, he said. No back and forth. The evidence is conclusive. My team's names popped up one by one. 13 people, 13 careers, turned into a PowerPoint slide. I tried to say something. Mason didn't even look at me. He just tapped that screen like the data was more important than actual human beings. To protect shareholder confidence, he continued, the entire risk unit will be terminated immediately. Effective today. No transition period, no appeals. The room went dead quiet. Funny how nobody speaks up when their own jobs might be next. Here's the thing. I built those systems he was trashing. Spent years on them, working with a team that treated compliance like their lives depended on it. We designed safeguards that regulators actually praised. Competitors tried to copy what we did. Mason had showed up just weeks earlier, all smiles and handshakes, saying how impressed he was with our architecture. Then he quietly started restricting our access under executive authority. Now he was using our own numbers to destroy us. When he finally said my name, he did it real casual. Director Reed, ultimate accountability rests with you. I didn't argue. Not because I agreed, but because something was off about that number he kept throwing around. It wasn't estimated or rounded. It was exact, down to the penny. That kind of precision doesn't come from reports. It only exists if someone had been digging around in the system's core validation layer. And I sure as hell never gave him that access. The military taught me to trust my gut. What I was seeing wasn't panic or negligence, it was preparation. Let me back up a bit. A few years ago we had a real crisis. Cash flow collapsed, vendors circling like vultures, lenders tightening the screws. The board was throwing around euphemisms instead of just saying bankruptcy. That's when my team stepped in. There were 13 of us spread across risk, compliance, and controls. We worked nights that turned into mornings, mapping exposure country by country, rebuilding approval chains, designing fraud barriers that satisfied regulators on 3 continents. We didn't make speeches about it, we just made systems that worked. When the audits came back clean and the crisis passed, nobody threw us a party. That's fine. Survival doesn't usually get applause. Over time, our work became invisible, which was exactly the point. Good risk management fades into the background. We created dashboards that executives trusted without really understanding them. We built safeguards that prevented disasters nobody ever knew were coming. I watched junior analysts grow into specialists, watched my team take real pride in stopping problems before they even had names. All that history lived in processes, not in fancy presentations. Then Mason Clark showed up with his mandate to modernize. In his first presentation, he put up a timeline labeled Legacy Exposure. Everything we'd built got condensed into one gray block. Outdated structures, he called them. Well-intentioned but risky in today's environment. He never mentioned the near collapse we'd prevented. Never mentioned the regulators who'd praised our framework. Just erased all that context with a mouse click. Listening to him rewrite our history was worse than being accused of fraud. He made experience sound like laziness, made caution sound like weakness. According to Mason, we weren't protecting the company. We were holding it back. The room ate it up. People love having a villain they can actually see. What really got to me was how fast the story changed. Years of solid work reduced to a liability. I felt like I was being thrown out not because we'd failed, but because we remembered too much. After the meeting, we gathered in a small conference room. Nobody was shouting or anything. Then Chloe Patterson, one of our senior analysts, frowned at her laptop screen. She'd been checking access logs out of habit. muscle memory from years of audits. "Lucas," she said slowly, "this doesn't look right." She turned the screen toward me. Mason's credentials were showing up all over the place, multiple restricted layers, including validation controls that were supposed to be independent oversight only, not executive summaries, not dashboards, core access, the kind no CEO should ever need. That explained everything. The confidence, the urgency to get rid of us, the exact numbers. Access like that bypassed every safeguard we'd designed to prevent exactly this kind of abuse. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. This wasn't a mistake or bad judgment. This was planned. And if Mason had done this once, he'd done it before. That night, I went home and dug into the backup files I'd kept off the main system. I'd created these copies years ago for regulatory stuff, hadn't touched them in months. Now they felt like the only honest records left in the world. I started with the boring stuff, timestamps, raw access trails, no summaries, no fancy charts, just the data trail. And that's when the pattern showed up, slow and ugly like a bruise forming. There were edits made after hours, late night, early morning, always quick, always precise. They weren't deleting anything obvious. Instead, they were shifting values around, adjusting classifications, tweaking flags just enough to change what the data meant. Every single change had executive authorization attached, Mason Clark's credentials. Here's what really got me. It wasn't sloppy. Whoever did this knew exactly how much they could change without anyone noticing. They didn't break our controls. They bent them. Risk thresholds got recalibrated so normal stuff would look suspicious when you viewed it the wrong way. It was slick. Made my stomach turn. I followed the trail backwards, comparing what the data looked like before and after. Same transactions, same amounts, same everything. Only the story changed. Legitimate adjustments became suspicious patterns. Safety overrides became red flags. You didn't need fake data to create fraud, you just needed the right angle. That's when I knew for sure this wasn't about emotions or office politics. This was about precision. I documented everything, timestamps, who authorized what, how the changes connected. The more I mapped it out, the clearer it got. These weren't defensive moves, they were prep work. Someone had reshaped the data so that when you looked at it without context, it would point directly at one group. The team that actually understood how the system worked. My team. Before I closed the files, I checked something else. I pulled up some old case studies from my personal files, stuff I'd saved when consulting on compliance failures at other companies. One report jumped out immediately. Different company, different industry, same exact setup, same timing patterns. The edits matched almost perfectly. Late night changes, minimal fingerprints, no deleted data, just reframed information. In that case, the CEO had blamed the legacy risk team to justify restructuring before a merger. The whole thing blew up later when regulators found inconsistencies nobody could explain. I stared at the name on that old report. Mason Clark. So there it was. This wasn't his first rodeo. Mason had a playbook, and he'd used it before. He knew how to turn good governance into guilt and shut up the people who could challenge him. I backed up everything again. This time with notes, no more doubts. What I had left was a plan. If Mason was reusing his old tricks, that meant his old weaknesses were still there too. Look, anger doesn't help when you're in a situation like this. But when I figured out why we were chosen instead of why we were accused, everything clicked. My team was clean. No scandals, no office drama, no political games. 13 people with reputations built on being careful and documenting everything. We were clean enough to be believable bad guys and disciplined enough not to lose our minds in public. Mason didn't need actual criminals. He needed a structure to blame. When you blame one person, people feel sorry for them. When you blame a whole system, people accept it. By going after the entire risk division, he made it sound like a cultural problem, not a personal one. That explained why everything happened so fast. No investigation, no appeals, public execution. Mass termination wasn't punishment, it was proof. It let Mason stand in front of the board and look like decisive leadership. 13 people gone in one shot meant 13 salaries saved, 13 voices silenced, and one clean story for the investors. Restructuring always needs a reason. We were his reason. I went through internal communications next, looking for intent rather than evidence of wrongdoing. Found it buried in some boring folder shared with executive operations, a restructuring roadmap, dated and approved weeks before he accused us of anything. The document laid out department cuts, budget moves, messaging strategy. Our division was listed as Phase 1, risk containment, clinical language. Necessary, final. The accusation hadn't caused the plan. The plan had needed the accusation. My jaw was tight, but my hands stayed steady. Getting mad would just play into Mason's story. Staying controlled would tear it apart. I didn't go public with any of this. Mason was expecting outrage, press statements, maybe a lawsuit he could spin as sour grapes. I gave him nothing. When you choose to stay quiet deliberately, it bothers people who need noise to control the story. Instead, I went after the foundation under all the theater. Our company's survival depended on international money, sovereign funds, cross-border investment vehicles, institutions with compliance rules tougher than anything our board enforced. Buried in those agreements were governance triggers. If certain risk indicators got flagged, external partners had the right to demand immediate verification. These weren't suggestions, they were requirements. I activated them without drama, without accusations, just process, using documentation that was already on record. I submitted formal notices through the right channels, citing problems with executive access controls and unauthorized data changes after approval. I didn't mention Mason by name, I didn't mention my team, I just referenced conditions that required review according to the contracts. The response was fast and impersonal. That's how real power works. Within 48 hours, partners were asking for fresh data tied to major cash flows. They wanted independent confirmation of validation rules. They wanted to know why executive credentials had bypassed safeguards without dual authorization. Questions that couldn't be brushed off as internal politics because they weren't internal anymore. Mason tried to stay calm about it. He sent out a memo telling everyone the reviews were routine. Standard diligence, he called it. But routine reviews don't happen across multiple regions at the same time. Standard diligence doesn't freeze people's calendars. Behind the scenes, I watched the requests pile up. Audit firms wanted access windows. Legal teams wanted timelines. Compliance officers wanted explanations that couldn't fit on a PowerPoint slide. Mason's neat little story was starting to unravel under its own weight. I stayed quiet through all of it. Every response I gave was by the book, documented, completely professional. I let the system do the talking because it was fluent in a language Mason couldn't control. Then came the call that changed everything. One of our biggest international funds called Executive Operations. They were temporarily suspending disbursements, their exact words. Pending clarification of governance risk. No drama, no ultimatums. Just a pause that carried serious weight. Money doesn't need to shout to get attention. That suspension hit like a shock wave. Forecasts changed overnight. Timelines slipped. Questions that had been theoretical suddenly became urgent. Mason's restructuring plan needed smooth operations to work. Pauses kill momentum. And momentum was all he had left. For the first time since this whole thing started, I felt something loosen up in my chest. Not relief exactly, more like confirmation. The path I'd chosen didn't need confrontation. It just needed alignment with rules that were written long before Mason ever showed up. Power doesn't back down quietly, though. When the pressure started hitting Mason's plans, he didn't step back and think things through. He doubled down. It started with the language he used about me. Suddenly, I was a disgruntled former employee in his internal memos. Someone emotionally invested in old ways of doing things, unable to accept organizational change. The wording was calculated. It made evidence look like resentment and process look like sabotage. Mason knew boards are more scared of instability than they are of injustice. The message went company-wide. He denied any governance failures, called the partner inquiries routine, and said the suspended fund was overreacting to incomplete information. He positioned himself as the steady hand, the adult in the room cleaning up messes left by people like me. I read the memo twice, not for what it said, but for what it revealed. It wasn't written to convince employees. It was written for the board. I didn't respond publicly, didn't correct anything. I let his words sit out there because, when you overstate your case, time has a way of making you look foolish. That afternoon, I got a short call from the company's legal counsel. No small talk, just information. The board's legal advisors had stepped in. They weren't accusing Mason of anything. They weren't defending me either. They just recommended an independent governance review by an external firm with full system access, reporting directly to the board instead of the CEO. It was the one move Mason couldn't spin. An independent review stripped him of control over the story without directly challenging his authority. It sounded responsible, neutral, necessary, exactly the kind of language boards use when they're quietly backing away from someone. When Mason's office announced they welcomed the review, calling it prudent, you could tell his reaction was different behind closed doors. Word was his door stayed shut, calls went unanswered, meetings got rescheduled. Control doesn't disappear all at once. It just gets thinner until it's not really there anymore. A week later, I got an invitation that didn't list me as an employee. It listed me as an external governance specialist. That distinction mattered. I walked into that boardroom without a company badge, without an assigned seat, and without any obligation to protect anyone's feelings. Mason was already there when I arrived, still composed, still confident, still wearing that expression like he owned the narrative. I didn't start by throwing accusations around. I started with the basics, how our validation layers were supposed to work, how access was divided up, how risk indicators were meant to surface problems quietly instead of theatrically. Then I showed what happened when those layers got bypassed. The numbers on the screen shifted, not dramatically, precisely. This isn't a glitch, I said. It's a cascade effect. I walked them through the sequence, executive credentials bypassing dual controls, thresholds getting recalibrated during off hours, data reframed to suggest problems where none existed. Each change by itself looked harmless. Put them together, and they formed a clear path. I paused before the next slide. If this pattern continues unchecked, I said, we're not looking at a few million in exposure. We're looking at $1.3 billion. I let that number sit there, not as a scare tactic, as a mathematical fact. The room shifted. Board members leaned forward. The legal team stopped taking notes. I showed how the altered risk profile affected capital allocation, insurance coverage, regulatory standing across multiple jurisdictions, how one distorted report created cascading assumptions downstream. The fraud wasn't theft. It was misrepresentation designed to justify getting rid of people. Every line of altered data traced back to the same access point. Mason finally spoke up. That interpretation is speculative, he said sharply. You're connecting dots that may not be connected. I didn't answer him directly. I clicked to the final comparison slide. Here's why it's not speculative, I said. 2 archived cases appeared next to our current situation. Different companies, different industries, same sequence, same timing, same surgical precision, the same signature approach to recalibration. The board chair looked up slowly. These are from Mason's previous positions, she said. The silence that followed was heavy and final. For the first time, Mason's confidence cracked. He shifted in his chair, pressed his lips together, glanced toward the legal team. I closed my laptop. This isn't about assigning guilt, I said. This is about recognizing a pattern. The truth didn't explode. It just landed, clean and final. Mason's story collapsed under the weight of its own repetition. By the time that meeting ended, nobody was talking about terminations or restructuring anymore. They were talking about containment, disclosure, and liability. I walked out knowing we'd crossed a line, not emotionally, financially, legally, permanently. $1.3 billion has a way of ending arguments completely. The board didn't waste time with drama. After a quick huddle with legal counsel, the chair cleared her throat and read one sentence into the record. Mason Clark is suspended effective immediately, pending results of an independent investigation. Access revoked. Authority frozen. The room let out a breath nobody realized they'd been holding. Next came the correction, a formal statement drafted by legal and sent company-wide. It named our risk division specifically and stated clearly that no internal fraud had been identified. 13 people publicly cleared. Our reputations restored not with apologies but with facts. It wasn't loud, it was official, which mattered more. An external firm got hired that same afternoon. Full access, independent reporting lines that bypassed executive leadership completely. The investigation had scope, budget, and teeth. Whatever came out next wouldn't be shaped by internal politics. I felt satisfied, but it was controlled satisfaction, like pressure releasing through a safety valve instead of blowing up. This wasn't victory, it was stabilization. Justice doesn't usually announce itself with fireworks. It arrived through a short notice circulated quietly, stating that Mason Clark's employment had been terminated and external authorities had been notified. No commentary, no explanations, just procedure. The building felt different that day, lighter somehow. People talked quieter. Meetings ended early. Relief doesn't make noise when it shows up. That afternoon, I called my team together in a small conference room. 13 of us again, sitting the same way we used to during those late-night crisis reviews. Except now nobody was worried about speaking up. I didn't prepare some big speech. I looked at them and said what felt true. We didn't win by destroying anybody, I told them. We won because the truth doesn't stay buried forever. You can manage it, spin it, reframe it for a while. But eventually it surfaces. Nobody clapped. They nodded. Understanding runs deeper than applause. We talked about next steps, rebuilding controls, earning back trust, practical stuff. The work ahead mattered more than what had ended. As the meeting broke up, Quinn Roberts, our youngest team member, hung back. She hesitated, then said, "From now on, I'm documenting everything. Every access, every change, every conversation." I smiled at that. Not because I was proud exactly, but because she'd learned the right lesson. Documentation isn't paranoia. It's institutional memory with structure. The company would move forward. Imperfect, but aware now. That was enough for me. I wasn't looking for closure. I was looking for systems that couldn't be bent by ego again. A week later, the board asked me back. Not to apologize, to rebuild. They offered expanded authority, direct reporting lines, independence guarantees, the kind of role designed to prevent silence. I listened without interrupting. Offers sound different after betrayal. I asked about safeguards, oversight, real independence. They answered carefully, honestly. Then I named my condition. No confidentiality agreements on findings, no buried reports. If something surfaces, it stays visible regardless of who gets embarrassed. The room went quiet again, but this time with respect. They understood the trade-off. Transparency brings scrutiny, but secrecy multiplies damage. After a pause, the chair agreed. The company would rebuild in public or not at all. Coming back felt heavier than leaving had. Familiar hallways carried new weight. People watched, uncertain what I represented now. I wasn't there to heal feelings. I was there to enforce memory. Systems fail when lessons fade. My job was to make forgetting expensive. The cleanup continued long after the headlines moved on. Policies changed, access controls tightened, incentive structures shifted. Slow work, unglamorous, essential. Accountability doesn't restore innocence. It restores direction. That evening, I stayed late reviewing new oversight protocols and access maps. The building was quiet, most people gone home to their families. I felt that calm I'd been chasing since this whole thing started. For the first time in months, fear wasn't driving my decisions. Responsibility was. As I locked up and walked out to the quiet street, I thought about what I'd learned. This story was never really about revenge. It was about dignity. About what happens when regular people refuse to let their work, their integrity, their silence get rewritten by power. I felt the fear during all this, the doubt, the urge to just disappear and start over somewhere else. But I learned something simple and hard. Doing the right thing rarely feels brave when you're doing it. It just feels necessary. And necessity, when you repeat it enough times, becomes strength. The truth is, most workplace injustice gets buried under process and politics. People stay quiet because speaking up costs more than staying silent. But sometimes, not often, but sometimes, the system remembers what it's supposed to do. When that happens, it doesn't need applause to keep working. It just needs people willing to document what they see and trust that accuracy eventually wins over theater. I walked home that night knowing the company would be different. Not perfect, but alert, and alert was good enough. Because in the end, fairness isn't dramatic, it's durable. When systems remember their purpose, ordinary people don't have to fight so hard just to be believed. That knowledge felt steady, earned, final. Like something that would last long after the people involved moved on to other battles. Justice done right doesn't need an audience, it just needs to work.